Middle East is on the brink.
This was a dangerous and unnecessary escalation.
The world feels at the brink of war as it waits for Israel's response to a massive missile and drone attack by Iran. Now, over the weekend, we saw Iran launch an unprecedented attack against Israeli territory, unprecedented both in scale and the fact it was the first time that Iran has launched a direct attack from its soil towards Israel's. And we wait to see how Israel responds amid fears that this could spiral into a regional conflict, could spiral further into World War III. Late on Saturday night, Iran launched about 180 drones, one-way attack kamikaze drones, about 80 ballistic missiles and about 30 cruise missiles at targets across Israel. Now, this, Iran said, was an act of self-defense. It was in response to an attack by Israel on a consular building in Damascus in Syria that killed 7 people, including 2 generals from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Iran invoked Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which asserts each nation's right to self-defense, and it appears to have telegraphed its plans both to the United States and indeed to the international community, because the US issued warnings about an imminent attack, and we know that the United States was involved in coordinating a massive and extraordinarily successful operation by allies to protect Israel. So what we saw as those missiles were airborne, and many of them took many, many hours from the point they were launched to reach Israel, or at least would have taken many hours, they were intercepted by the United States, by Israel, by Royal Air Force jets, and indeed by regional allies, Arab countries, including, we understand, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and possibly others as well. America has said it shot down at least 80 of those drones, and 6 ballistic missiles, most likely shot down with its Aegis missile defense system, which exists on the Arleigh Burke class missile destroyers, which are a warship, at least one of which is based in the eastern Mediterranean off the Israeli coast. And these are extraordinary missiles which can launch to the edge of space and intercept incoming missiles on the edge of Earth's atmosphere. So this was unprecedented both in scale and indeed potentially in complexity. Since October 7th, when Hamas launched a surprise attack against Israel that killed some 1,200 people, tensions have been fueled across the region, and Iran's Revolutionary Guard are suspected and indeed accused both by Israel and other allies of coordinating many of the proxies, the Iranian-backed proxies in the region which have been attacking Israel. And that includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, that includes Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and it includes the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who've been launching both missile strikes at Israel and missile and drone strikes at international shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Now, Israel and Iran have been enemies for many, many years, for decades. But I mean, certainly if we look back to 2006, when Israel invaded southern Lebanon, that was a battle Israel was fighting against Hezbollah, an Iranian-backed proxy. More recently, we've seen Israel's intelligence services, most likely Mossad, carry out assassinations of members of the Iran's nuclear weapons program, including the high-profile killing in 2020 of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the head of that program. That was an extraordinarily complex, audacious operation that we understand used a remote-controlled machine gun mounted in a car that killed Fakhrizadeh as he was driving around Iran when he believed he was safe. Subsequent to that, Iran has also accused Israel of assassinating at least 7 other officials in 2022. And what we've seen in recent months during the conflict in Gaza, we've seen both sides lobbing missiles at each other's interests in third countries, in Syria, in Kurdistan, and in Iraq. Iran saying on Saturday night, as some of those missiles were likely still in the air, that it considered its attack concluded. Now, that was perhaps before it was clear that 99% of those missiles and drones were successfully shot down. That's a figure that's come from Israel. The United States, President Biden, has urged Israel to take the win, and that message was echoed by Britain's Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron this morning. The international community, Israel's allies, including Britain, America, France, many other countries, the European Union, have all urged Israel to show restraint. Because right now, what happens next could still affect whether or not this is seen as a closed chapter in the relations between Israel and Iran, whether or not this is a contained incident, or whether or not this spirals into a wider regional conflict. Now, the allies that helped to protect Israel have insisted that their support they will continue to defend Israel. But in parallel with that message, the United States has made clear that it will not take part or support in a retaliatory strike against Iran. Now, that has left Israel with a very difficult decision to make. There is clearly pressure on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to retaliate against Iran for what has happened over the weekend. But to do so risks escalation, and that is exactly what the international community has tried very hard to avoid. It's interesting, if you look at how this Iranian attack was effectively foiled, it involved a number of allies working in a number of third countries to shoot down those missiles and drones. Most of them, in fact, all of the drones, we understand, were shot down before they reached Israeli territory. Now, that's most likely over perhaps Saudi Arabia, certainly Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, possibly other countries as well. That avoided the need for any of those allies to shoot their missiles into Iranian sovereign territory, which is where we understand most of the missiles were launched. Again, deliberately avoiding direct confrontation between Israel's allies, the United States, the UK, and others, avoiding confrontation with Iran. Those same allies saying they do not want to be part of a retaliatory strike now. So what happens next? Well, the ball is firmly in Israel's court. There's been an attack against an Iranian interest. Iran has responded with a massive but ultimately largely unsuccessful attack against Israel. And that could be the end of it. We wait to see whether the government in Israel will abide by the pressure and advice of its allies to leave it be and to focus instead on its main objective at the moment of destroying Hamas. Israel has said that it will exact a price from Iran for this attack, but it hasn't said where, it hasn't said when, and it hasn't said how. Were Israel to launch an overt military strike against Iranian soil, that is perhaps the worst case scenario, certainly from the point of view of Israel's allies who are trying to contain this. In a tit-for-tat conflict, in an eye-for-an-eye exchange, it could make the whole world go blind. That is the concern. Israel shoots back with similar sorts of weapons and drones that have been fired at its territory. Iran may or may not be as successful in shooting them down. Extraordinarily, what we saw on Saturday night and Sunday morning from those 300 plus missiles and drones is so far reports of just one child who was tragically injured, but just one person injured is extraordinary given the scale and the power of the weapons that were aimed at Israel. Were Israel to strike back, there's every chance that their success might be more violent or more successful, might inflict more death and damage. We've seen that Israel has within its power the opportunity and the ability to inflict huge damage and extraordinary numbers of casualties, as we've seen in the Gaza Strip. More than 33,000 people have been killed. Huge swathes of that territory reduced to rubble. Anything on that scale on Iranian soil would, of course, demand another response. And Iran has signaled this time, or has signaled rather, that were allies like the United States, the United Kingdom, to continue the sort of defences they've shown already, then perhaps the bases they use to carry out that defence of Israel might also come under attack. And that's where it risks spiralling. Israel can hit back at Iran. Iran hits back a second time, retaliates again. Allies like the United States, United Kingdom feeling obliged to come in and defend Israel. Then the bases that United States, the United Kingdom, perhaps Saudi Arabia, Jordan using also coming under attack. And then suddenly, before we know it, there's 5 or 6 nations fighting a hot war in the Middle East. And we cannot forget that Iran is tightly bound up in the conflict in Ukraine as well, because Iran and Russia have become tighter allies over the last 2 years, as Iran has been one of the only countries willing to supply tyrant Vladimir Putin with weapons. And indeed, it's these same deadly kamikaze drones, the Shahed drones, which Iran has been selling to Russia, which Iran also used against Israel on Saturday night. So were that conflict to erupt in the Middle East, it would be linked to what is going on the eastern flank of Europe. The same allies that would be dragged into a conflict around Israel are already involved in trying to support Ukraine. Their focus, their resources would be diluted. And again, worst case scenario, that would spell, or at least signal, an opportunity, if they saw the West and the West allies distracted, for those who would wish the West harm, to start more conflicts in other parts of the world.